Rural Indiana, 1921, and a county education inspector is standing in front of a locked door. The order nailed to it is stamped with the seal of the United States Bureau of Education. The ink is still dark. The paper still crisp. The wood of the door itself is old, seasoned, cut from timber that was standing before the Civil War, and the grain of it runs straight and tight in the way that old-growth lumber does. The kind of wood that does not warp or split easily. The kind of wood that was chosen deliberately by someone who understood that a building meant to last required materials selected with care. Inside, through the single warped window, the chalkboard is visible. And on that chalkboard, untouched, unsmudged, precisely rendered, is a diagram that does not appear in any state-approved curriculum published before or after 1900. It shows a geometric proportion system, structural ratios, the relationship between ceiling height, window placement, and interior floor area, rendered with a precision that suggests not a rural school teacher improvising on a Tuesday morning, but someone who understood architecture as a science of the human body and its relationship to space, to light, to the carrying of sound across a room. The inspector photographs the door. He does not photograph the chalkboard. That photograph, if it was ever taken, has not been found. The question this building raises is not a small one. Who designed these structures? What were they actually teaching inside them? And why did more than 10,000 of them vanish from the American landscape in a single decade between 1917 and 1927? Not abandoned, but demolished. Not forgotten, but officially erased. To understand why this disappeared, you have to go back to the mid-19th century, to a school system that was not built by the government at all, that preceded the government's interest in education by a generation, and that was functioning coherently and effectively, long before anyone in Washington decided it needed to be replaced. Begin in the 1840s. The frontier settlements of Ohio, Indiana, Kansas, Nebraska, and the territories spreading north into what would become Manitoba are filling with people who need to educate children without a state apparatus to tell them how. Communities pool funds, select sites, and build. What they build is not random. Look at the county land survey records from 1850 to 1880 and something immediately unusual surfaces. The schoolhouses are not placed arbitrarily. They sit on elevated ground, at consistent intervals from community centers, oriented with a precision that exceeds what township plat grids would require. More striking still, the structural dimensions recur across counties that had no documented contact with each other. The doorframe widths match, the ceiling-to-floor proportions match. The window-to-wall ratios, which govern how much natural light enters and from how many directions simultaneously, appear in schoolhouses separated by hundreds of miles and no shared architectural institution. No single federal agency issued a design mandate. No professional architect has been credited with distributing a standard plan. Andrew Draper, who served as New York State Superintendent of Public Instruction beginning in 1886, noted in administrative correspondence that the rural school buildings of the preceding generation displayed a consistency he could not account for. He did not pursue the question. The pattern, however, does not disappear simply because no one is willing to follow it. Something distributed this design. Something that left no surviving paper trail, or whose paper trail was removed at a later point, ensured that a structurally coherent approach to school architecture spread across an entire continent before any government had the mechanism or the intention to do so. When you lay the survey records side by side, the recurring dimensions feel less like coincidence and more like instruction. Instruction from a source that has not been identified. That question has not been answered by any educational historian on record. Inside these buildings, the curriculum was stranger still. The name William Holmes McGuffey is remembered today primarily as the author of a reading series, the McGuffey Eclectic Readers. published beginning in 1836 and used in classrooms across rural America through the 1870 and 1880. What is less commonly remembered is what those original editions actually contained. Alongside reading passages and moral instruction, the early McGuffey readers included lessons in practical geometry, the measurement of irregular land parcels, the principles of natural philosophy, and basic structural proportion. Students in one-room schools during this period were being taught, as a matter of basic literacy, how to calculate the area of a field, how to read the position of celestial bodies well enough to navigate by them, how to understand the load-bearing logic of a wall or a roof, how to assess the stability of a foundation. These were not elective enrichments added by ambitious teachers. They were presented as fundamental knowledge that any person living on the land needed in order to function as a legal and economic actor in their own right. A student who completed a McGuffey curriculum in 1865 could, in principle, survey the boundaries of a contested parcel, present a measurement argument before a county court, and build a structure to a load-bearing standard, all without hiring a professional intermediary. Now compare those original editions to the revised McGuffey readers that began appearing after 1900. The difference is not subtle. The geometry lessons are gone. The natural philosophy sections are gone. The land measurement exercises have been replaced with civic instruction and industrial process reading. The celestial navigation content has vanished entirely. Someone authorized this removal. No public debate surrounds that decision. No legislative record documents the discussion that preceded it. The books simply changed, and the knowledge inside them simply disappeared, and no official explanation was ever offered for why the content that had defined the curriculum for half a century was quietly excised. Someone edited the books. The edits were never explained. The schoolhouses these books were used in deserve a much closer examination, because the buildings themselves contain evidence that the dominant historical account of the frontier school as a crude, improvised structure does not survive contact with the physical record. Horace Mann, the Massachusetts school reformer who served as secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education beginning in 1837, traveled extensively through the rural United States during the 1842, documenting conditions and making arguments for reform. His 1843 Report on Education is a foundational document in American educational history, cited constantly in the literature of progressive schooling. It argues passionately for better funding, more professional teachers, improved facilities, and centralized oversight. What it does not do, despite the fact that man traveled through regions dense with functioning rural schools, is describe the existing network in any substantive way. He does not catalog what the buildings looked like. He does not describe what was being taught inside them. He writes as though the rural school is a problem to be solved, not a system already operating with considerable coherence and reach. But man had seen these schools. He walked through communities where they stood. He was a meticulous observer and a prolific writer, and the omission is not consistent with his habits of documentation in other areas. What it functions as, in the written record, is a deliberate erasure of a baseline. And here is where the first and most important twist in this story becomes impossible to ignore. These schools were not primitive. They were not failing. Interior documentation from surviving county records in Ohio and Indiana described schoolhouses with raised platform floors that improved sightlines and acoustics simultaneously, ceilings at heights that modern acoustic engineers would recognize as calibrated for unamplified voice projection across a full room, and window configurations that provided cross-directional natural light throughout the school day, regardless of the season or the orientation of the building. These were not the crude structures that the reform narrative required them to be. They were locally funded, architecturally coherent, intellectually broad, and entirely outside the administrative reach of any centralized authority. They were closed, not because they were failing. They were closed precisely because they were working. And because what they produced an educated, practically skilled, legally literate rural population capable of operating independently was incompatible with the economic and institutional order that was being constructed around them. The geographic reach of this school network extended well beyond the American frontier, and that extension is one of the most troubling features of the whole pattern. Between 1860 and 1900, structurally similar buildings and curricular emphases appeared in the rural settlements of Canada, in farming communities across parts of eastern Australia, and in colonial educational outposts across southern Africa. John Eaton, who served as United States Commissioner of Education from 1870 to 1886, documented the American portion of this picture in a series of annual reports that are rarely consulted today. Eaton was attempting to construct a federal picture of American education, and what he encountered in the rural territories unsettled him in ways his formal reports never fully articulate. The language in those annual reports shifts visibly over the 15 years of his tenure. Early reports describe rural schools in terms of what they are doing, their enrollment numbers, their subject coverage, their community role. Later reports begin describing them in terms of what they should be doing instead, their deficiencies, their irregularities, their resistance to standardization. The shift from documentation to correction happens gradually, somewhere around 1878, and after that point, the rural school in federal language becomes a problem requiring intervention rather than a phenomenon requiring understanding. Meanwhile, across the Commonwealth territories, the same architectural fingerprints were appearing in communities that had no institutional connection to the American frontier. The same window proportions, the same curricular emphasis on practical geometry and land measurement. No international curriculum body existed that could have coordinated this. No colonial education authority had issued matching design standards across 3 separate continents. The pattern was there. It seemed like local improvisation, scattered and independent, until the same floor plan appeared in a schoolhouse outside Johannesburg. At that point, the question of a common origin becomes something more than academic. The man who articulated the philosophy that would replace this system did not conceal his intentions. William Torrey Harris served as United States Commissioner of Education from 1889 to 1906, the longest continuous tenure in the history of that office. 17 years during which the National Educational Framework underwent its most consequential transformation. His 1,898 essay, Psychologic Foundations of Education, is a document that rewards sustained reading when placed alongside the record of what the rural schools were actually teaching. Harris argued, explicitly and at considerable length, that the purpose of education was to instill in children the habits of conformity, subordination to authority, and regularity. He was not presenting these outcomes as unfortunate side effects of managing large student populations. He was prescribing them as primary goals. The child who emerged from Harris's educational model would be punctual, obedient, responsive to institutional authority, and oriented toward participation in a supervised economic structure. The contrast with what the one-room schools were producing is so precise and so total that it reads not as a philosophical disagreement about educational theory, but as a targeted response to a specific threat. The old curriculum produced students who could measure their own land, argue their own legal cases before county courts, build their own structures to a professional standard, and navigate terrain and law without institutional assistance. Harris's curriculum produced students who arrived on time, followed instructions without questioning their origin, and deferred to authority as a matter of trained reflex. Harris didn't just want new schools. He wanted different children, and the paper record he left behind suggests he understood with considerable clarity exactly what kind of person he was replacing. The architectural anomalies that state inspection campaigns uncovered during the surveys of the 1,890 and early 1,900 complicated the demolition narrative in ways that the inspectors themselves seemed unwilling to pursue. State-level school inspection campaigns in the Midwest and Plain states were tasked with cataloging existing structures in preparation for the consolidation campaigns that reformers were already planning. What the inspectors found in several counties was a category of building that resisted the improvised frontier characterization entirely. Vaulted interior roof structures with joinery details that implied formal training. Stone foundation geometries laid to tolerances that exceeded any documented local construction capacity. Load-bearing configurations and interior spatial arrangements that implied, to anyone trained in building, the hand of someone who had studied architectural proportion as a formal discipline. The construction records for these buildings do not exist in the state archives. The period from 1860 to 1890, during which any structure of this complexity would normally have generated permit applications, contractor agreements, and material delivery records, is silent on these schoolhouses. They appear in land records. They appear in property tax rolls going back decades. They do not appear in any document that explains who built them, who designed them, or where the construction knowledge came from. No permit, no contractor, no explanation. Just a building that by every material measure should not exist in the place and time it was found. The inspection reports noted these anomalies in passing and then moved forward. Because the mandate was consolidation, not archaeology. The economic logic behind what replaced these schools becomes legible when you examine who provided the funding for the replacement campaign. John D. Rockefeller established the General Education Board in 1902, and the founding documents of that institution are specific about its purpose in ways that are arresting to read in the context of what the rural schools were producing. The GEB did not describe its mission as improving the quality of existing education. It described its mission as producing a specific type of person suited to the requirements of the emerging industrial economy. Frederick Taylor, whose Principles of Scientific Management were published in 1911 and within months applied to educational theory by reformers who found in his factory model an irresistible template for mass schooling, provided the operational vocabulary. Schools should be factories. Students should be inputs. Graduates should be standardized outputs. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel operations depended on the labor force trained to precision task performance rather than independent technical judgment, funded parallel reform initiatives. The founding language of the General Education Board raises a question it never answers. Who benefits from a population that cannot read a land survey, cannot calculate the area of a disputed parcel, cannot build a structure without hiring a licensed professional, cannot navigate a legal proceeding without retained counsel? The rural schools were not failing the economy. They were failing to produce a worker who needed to be employed, who needed to buy services he had previously been educated to perform himself. That failure, from the perspective of an emerging industrial order built on the monetization of basic competencies, was a structural problem requiring a structural solution. The public intellectual who translated this philosophy into actionable state policy was Elwood Cubberley of Stanford University. His 1909 book, Changing Conceptions of Education, provided the ideological architecture for what happened to the one-room schools between 1910 and 1925 more completely than any other single document. Cubberley compared schools to factories with an explicitness that leaves little room for charitable interpretation. He used the language of industrial inputs and standardized outputs. He argued that the variation between local school systems, their different buildings, their different curricula, their different emphases based on local knowledge and community need, was an inefficiency to be corrected by centralization. What he did not acknowledge, and what fragmentary literacy data from counties with intact rural school records appears to challenge, is that these schools were producing graduates of considerable practical and intellectual capability. The consolidation was not a response to failure. The consolidation was a response to success of the wrong kind. Cubberley, Harris, and the General Education Board together left a paper trail specific enough and consistent enough to read as coordinated institutional intent rather than parallel coincidence. The independent, architecturally coherent, practically educated rural school was a conscious target. It produced citizens equipped to operate outside the wage economy. The new system needed employees who could not. The physical erasure proceeded with administrative efficiency between 1917 and 1925. Consolidation orders were distributed across states whose legislatures had passed, enabling laws, and federal funding frameworks provided the financial mechanism. The orders, where they survive in state archives, specify physical demolition in terms that distinguish deliberate removal from simple decommissioning. The United States Census of Education, comparing its building counts from 1920 to 1930, documents the disappearance of more than 10,000 structures in a single decade, structures classified as unaffiliated rural common schools. These were not schools that gradually fell out of use and weathered away. Many of them were removed from the land by organized effort. The question of what made physical destruction preferable to conversion, what feature or content of those buildings required their elimination rather than their repurposing as community centers, storage facilities, or administrative offices, has not been answered in any official report. You don't demolish a building to modernize it. You demolish it to erase it. The distinction matters, and no official account has explained it. The curriculum erasure ran in precise parallel with the physical one, moving through the machinery of the state textbook adoption process with a coordination that implies central direction. State boards of education, convening in administrative sessions that produced minutes but rarely transcripts, revised subject requirements across the decade between 1910 and 1920. Practical geometry disappeared from elementary curricula without legislative debate. Natural philosophy was absorbed into a reduced science sequence stripped of its applied dimensions. Land measurement, the competency that had allowed rural families to hold legal ground against encroaching boundary surveys and disputed property claims, was removed from the curriculum entirely. Architectural proportion. The understanding of how structures relate to human scale and spatial function was never incorporated into any standardized curriculum at any level of American schooling before or after the consolidation period. These decisions were made in committee. They were not voted on in legislatures. They were not published for public comment. They moved through administrative channels and emerged as established facts. And by 1920, the subjects had been removed from the national educational record with a completeness that made them appear to anyone who encountered the post-consolidation curriculum as though they had never been standard content at all. 1,000 years of practical knowledge removed in 10 years by committee without a vote. Not everything was destroyed. In at least 3 rural counties, the consolidation orders were filed. The administrative reclassification was processed, and the buildings were officially redesignated. But they were not demolished. They were boarded shut. The windows were covered with planking. The interiors were whitewashed from floor to ceiling. They were entered on county property rolls as storage structures or agricultural equipment sheds, and in that bureaucratic reclassification, they became invisible to the educational archive entirely. In rural Montana, in portions of Ontario, and in at least 1 county in Kansas, structures matching the pre-consolidation architectural pattern survive into the present. Preservation researchers who have surveyed them in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have found, beneath layers of whitewash applied sometime after 1920, the original chalkboard surfaces. On those surfaces, geometric diagrams, proportion systems, structural ratio notation of the same class as the image the Indiana inspector photographed, but chose not to enter into his report. The whitewash was applied deliberately. No maintenance record accounts for it. No work order has been recovered. The features were concealed by an act that required labor, materials, and intent, not simply left to the passage of time. No official explanation accounts for why these specific buildings survived demolition when thousands of others did not. No official explanation accounts for who whitewashed the chalkboards, or when or under whose direction. The deliberative record for the consolidation campaign is, in the places where it would be most revealing, absent in ways that archivists themselves have described as anomalous. Federal archives from the Bureau of Education, covering the critical period between 1900 and 1930, contain the orders, the census data, and the outcome reports. The numbers exist. The demolition tallies exist. The curriculum revision announcements exist. What does not exist in any recoverable form, or what exists in a state of fragmentation and incompleteness that researchers describe as inconsistent with the Bureau's otherwise methodical record-keeping, are the deliberative documents that preceded the orders. The internal correspondence that coordinated the national campaign across multiple state systems simultaneously. The meeting records that captured the reasoning behind specific demolition requirements. Records held at the Rockefeller Archive Center related to the General Education Board's role in state-by-state consolidation have been partially cataloged, but historians reconstructing the decision chain have identified gaps that one archival assessment described as inconsistent with the GEB's standard institutional practices. The decisions survive in the record. The reasoning that produced them does not. That asymmetry is not how bureaucracies lose documents through negligence. It is how they manage what can be reconstructed. What remains, when you hold all of this together, is a shape with a very specific outline. A system that worked, producing practically skilled, legally capable, architecturally literate graduates across an entire continent, was targeted with coordinated institutional force across roughly 40 years. From the philosophical groundwork laid by Harris in the 1890 through the physical demolitions of the early 1920. By 1921, the year the United States Census of Education recorded the elimination of the last classified unaffiliated rural common school, the system had been removed so thoroughly from both the physical landscape and the educational record that most people alive today do not know it existed in the form it did. The one-room school of collective memory is a primitive thing. A rough cabin with a single tired teacher and a wood stove and children who couldn't wait to escape to something better. The one-room school of the documentary record is something else entirely. A structurally coherent, acoustically calibrated, architecturally consistent building distributed across a continent by a mechanism that has never been formally identified, teaching a curriculum that included land measurement, celestial navigation, structural geometry, practical legal reasoning, and the foundational knowledge of how the physical world is built and governed, producing graduates who could sustain themselves as independent economic and legal actors without institutional mediation. William Holmes McGuffey put that knowledge into the books. William Torrey Harris defined the philosophy that would replace it and spent 17 years in federal office, ensuring the replacement took hold. Elwood Cupperly wrote the policy language that made consolidation sound like progress. The General Education Board provided the financial architecture, and somewhere in the administrative machinery between those forces and the physical demolitions of the 1920, the deliberative record stopped being preserved in any form that allows reconstruction. What the current standardized curriculum teaches a child in the United States is not a neutral technological evolution from what was taught in a one-room schoolhouse in 1880. The gap between those two curricula is not a gap created by the advance of knowledge. It is a subtraction. Something was removed that could have been retained, and the absence of any recoverable deliberative record means the reasoning behind that subtraction has never been required to defend itself in any public forum. Before any legislature, before any community that lost the schools and the knowledge they carried, the schoolhouse in Indiana still holds the diagram on its chalkboard. The inspector who stood at the door in 1921 photographed the order and moved on. The diagram is still there, beneath a century of accumulated dust, in a building officially recorded as something other than a school. In a county whose children have been educated for 4 generations without ever being taught what that diagram means, or that anyone once considered its content basic literacy. Perhaps no one ordered it cleaned because no one believed anyone would ever look that closely. Or perhaps the people who closed the schools understood something precise and cold. That a diagram, severed from the teacher who knew its purpose, severed from the student whose hands would learn to apply it, severed from the community that had built the room it was drawn in, is only a shape on a wall, and a shape, unlike knowledge, cannot be passed on.